Hi folks, I'm just going to give a quick preview into the readings that we're going to be looking at Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of this week so that you are ready to jump in. As a reminder, all these readings are going to tie back in some way to the arguments made by Brandt, so make sure that you're feeling comfortable with those arguments. And if you have any questions about what happened in that article, feel free to post them in the discussion board, the main discussion board, and I'd be happy to get back to you on those. So this week we're going to be looking at articles by Cisneros and Rue. Today we'll be looking at a piece by Vershawn Ashanti Young on Thursday, and then Tejada and others on Friday of this week. So let's start with Cisneros and Rue. So Cisneros is going to talk to us about her experience growing up in a household as the only daughter amongst many sons. The impact that her father's sort of assumptions about gender played in why he was willing to have her go to college, what he was hoping for her to get out of that experience, and the ways that she was able to kind of subvert that towards her own ends. And so a number of the questions that she raises include, how does gender shape individual sponsorship, right? So how do assumptions about gender shape the way we are sponsored by individuals within our personal circles? How do gender roles impact the assumptions about higher education and its purpose? So if we think historically, right, for a very long time, only male students were admitted to colleges, and even once women were able to be admitted into colleges, there were a number of expectations in terms of the kinds of fields that they might pursue, and in many areas, those assumptions still persist to some degree. And so Cisneros wants to poke at that a little bit. And then finally, she sort of raises the question of what are the possibilities to subvert literacy sponsorship, right? And this harkens back to the White and Steele examples from Brandt, but the idea that just because your literacy practices are sponsored in a particular way with a particular set of expectations and assumptions and carrying a particular kind of ideological freight, as Brandt might put it, does not necessarily mean that you can't play around with that and find some other ways to work it towards your advantage. We'll also be looking at Rue today, and one of the things that ties Rue and Cisneros together is they're both playing around with the concept of how gender and literacy intersect. Now for Rue, she's looking at less at the personal level and more looking at the question of the institutional level, right? So she's looking at what kinds of stories, novels, etc. are taught within our classrooms, right? And as a framework for this, she's thinking about Little Women, and looking at the history of how that book has been taught, how it used to be a very prominent book in English language curricula and has gradually sort of fallen out of favor, and she wants to sort of poke at why. And in the process, she's raising questions about the assumptions that get made in terms of gender and literacy practices, and in particular, why concerns about boys, or why are concerns about boys privileged over concerns about girls, and in particular, the concern that there are certain kinds of books that boys simply will not read, and so we rather than expect them to broaden their horizons, we need to tailor our school curriculum to their needs rather than the women in the class who are expected to sort of be willing to read whatever is assigned. As part of this, she's asking the question, whose stories get told and where, right? So whose stories are appropriate for the classroom and whose stories are sort of relegated to the privacy of the home. And how does that impact the kinds of stories that we're willing to attend to or listen to, later in our lives? And she'll examine a couple of pieces of that in her essay. And again, so thinking about these two pieces sort of present sponsorship through the lens of both sort of the individual sponsor, but also schools as an institutional sponsor of literacy. Tomorrow we're going to look at the Young piece about whether or not students should write in their own languages. And I'll preface this by saying this is a challenging essay, and so you may want to even get a bit of a jump on it. But in essence, Young wants to question the notion of standard English, right? And he wants to unpack how standard English is really a function of a certain particular privileging of a particular variety of English tied to affluent white Americans, right? And so he wants to sort of poke at the question of who benefits from insisting on a single standard that is not really an arbitrary standard, but is a standard tied to a particular set of literacy practices belonging to a particular subset of Americans, and as a corollary to that, who suffers as a result. And then he wants to sort of help us understand what does it mean to think about racism in an institutional context, right? So what does it mean to think about racist practices within the context of a school setting rather than simply, individual racist attitudes? And how do certain assumptions about what constitute non-standard language practices harm speakers of other varieties of English? And then finally, he wants to sort of close with a sense of what would a more just approach to language and literacy education look like. So we'll be diving into this on Thursday, and I'll actually be putting together a separate video to help unpack a lot of the ideas that Young is putting forward. Finally, we're going to wrap up with Tejada et al., which is actually written by a group of students in the California university system who want to call into question the means by which students are assigned to quote-unquote remedial or developmental writing courses, and the ways in which the use of sort of a singular standard of English impacts that. What are the long-term implications on students' sense of self as writers, as well as sort of the practical implications for their ability to complete their degrees on time. Again, I talk about the tangible costs about using the assumptions of the traditional story of writing that puts a really heavy emphasis on error rather than content as a method for placing people within a college's curriculum. And then similar to Young, thinking about what are opportunities for reform to create a more equitable approach to how people's literacies are sponsored once they make their way into these broader institutional contexts. So I wish you luck as you're making your way through these readings. Again, every day I'm going to be posting new prompts in the discussion boards tied to the readings, so I hope that you'll get engaged in those conversations. I'll be jumping in a little bit as well, today, tomorrow, and Friday, so keep an eye out for that. And again, I'll be creating threads in the broader class-wide discussion group where if you have questions about the readings, you can certainly post those there, and I would be happy to address them. So hope everyone's doing well. Take care.